By the summer of 1940, the British Empire stood entirely alone in Europe. France had collapsed, and the Royal Navy was bleeding ships at a terrifying rate. We can see the scale of the threat in archival photos like this one. German U-boats were violently hunting in the North Atlantic, systematically severing the merchant supply lines that kept the island nation fed and fighting. Meanwhile, sitting completely idle in American naval yards across the Atlantic were over 100 World War I-era destroyers. They were mothballed, gathering dust, and functionally obsolete for modern U.S. fleet operations. The mathematics of the moment were brutal. Without an immediate, massive infusion of escort ships, Britain would starve, and control of the entire Atlantic would pass to the Axis powers. But sending those ships wasn't legally possible. As you can see in this photograph of an America First Committee rally, the U.S. public was fiercely isolationist. Congress had passed strict neutrality acts that outright banned selling weapons to any nation at war. President Franklin D. Roosevelt needed a workaround. He found one by framing a transfer not as foreign aid, but as a direct upgrade to American coastal defense, executing the maneuver entirely through a unilateral executive agreement. This map shows the September 1940 agreement. The U.S. handed over 50 aging destroyers. In direct exchange, Britain granted 99-year leases on 8 vital naval and air bases, from Newfoundland through the Caribbean, pushing America's defensive perimeter far out into the ocean. Through a massive real estate barter, the United States bypassed its neutrality laws and bought Britain the one resource it couldn't manufacture: time. There was one glaring problem. These 50 ships, primarily Wickes and Clemson-class flushdeckers, were built between 1917 and 1922 for 35-knot, short-range Pacific Fleet battles. They were never meant for grueling, slow-speed convoy escorts. This wireframe diagram highlights their severe physical limitations. They were completely uninsulated against freezing temperatures. Worse, their narrow hulls and heavy, elevated 4-inch guns disrupted their center of gravity, making them dangerously top-heavy and violently prone to rolling in North Atlantic gales. Yet, facing total collapse, the Royal Navy eagerly accepted them. They renamed them the Town class and immediately began aggressive, desperate overhauls, as seen in this shipyard photograph, where a hull has been stripped down to its very ribs. In a war of attrition, perfect is the enemy of good. Immediate operational availability completely trumped ideal naval architecture. To make them viable, British engineers had to hack the designs. Looking at this profile, you can see the initial subtraction phase, violently stripping away the heavy 4-inch guns and multiple torpedo banks to rapidly lower the ship's center of mass and clear out usable deck space. Then came the addition phase. They bolted on essential anti-submarine warfare technology. They added ASDIC, early sonar domes, to the hull, installed Type 286 radar masks, and expanded the rear racks to hold upwards of 50 heavy depth charges. But the most critical upgrade was a secret weapon called the Hedgehog mortar. Standard depth charges required a ship to pass directly over a submarine, temporarily losing sonar contact. The Hedgehog solved this blind spot by projecting an arc of 24 explosive bomblets to land in a tight cluster directly ahead of the ship, keeping the target firmly in the sonar beam. These retrofits didn't fix the miserable living conditions, and the 1910s-era boilers still failed constantly. But this mechanical hacking successfully birthed a dedicated, highly lethal subhunter. Between 1941 and 1943, these modified Town-class destroyers saturated the Atlantic. Before modern, purpose-built escorts could slide off the slipways, these aging castoffs relied on sheer numerical volume to enforce vital screens around merchant convoys. This archival photo captures the brutal human reality on board. Exhausted crews stood 18-hour watches on open, freezing bridges, constantly scanning the gray fog for the U-boat wolf packs that were actively hunting them. Their impact was measurable. In May 1941, HMS Broadway and Bulldog, both former U.S. ships, forced the German submarine U-110 to the surface. Before it could sink, boarding parties captured an intact Enigma cipher machine and its codebooks, an intelligence victory that rapidly accelerated the breaking of German naval codes. They were also used for ultimate sacrifices. As you can see in this photograph of a battered, partially submerged wreck, HMS Campbelltown was packed with delayed action explosives and deliberately rammed into the dry dock at Saint-Nazaire, France, successfully denying the massive German battleship Tirpitz an Atlantic repair base. Through sheer persistence, these tactical triumphs proved that a fleet of aging stopgap escorts could successfully bleed the U-boat fleet and secure the transatlantic supply lines. By 1944, British and Canadian shipyards were finally launching highly capable modern frigates in massive numbers. The battered Town-class ships, their hulls fatigued and their primary purpose fulfilled, were quietly pulled from the front lines and eventually scrapped. But the geopolitical payoff for the United States was permanent. The 8 overseas bases acquired in the 1940 trade formed the concrete foundation for modern American global power projection, extending its defensive and logistical reach far beyond its own shores. Those 50 obsolete ships successfully bridged the deadliest, most vulnerable gap in the Battle of the Atlantic, serving as the critical icebreaker for the Lend-Lease program and eventual Allied victory. The Destroyers for Bases deal proved that in a global conflict, you don't always need the perfect weapon. Sometimes, a patched-up fleet of cast-offs is the only thing standing between survival and defeat.